the Steve DeAngelo joins us for a shorter episode, but that doesn't stop him from sharing a ton. Gives us the background on what brought him to San Francisco originally. That's right, he was not always there. His thoughts on where we are as an industry and, of course, where we're going. So, Steve DeAngelo, enjoy. So we're here in Denver, and I have the Steve DeAngelo right here, right now.
Hi, how are you doing, Seth? Great to be here with you.
Fantastic to meet you in person the other day and have you on, if you will, today. I said it to you in person yesterday. You are the id of the industry, as I see it.
Well, thanks very much for that appreciation. You know, I've been doing this for a long, long time, and it's really exciting to see the changes that are coming take place today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that most folks think is that you just are from the Bay Area. You're an original Bay Area guy. You've been there for a while, but you're not originally from there.
Yeah, see, probably I should have been from the Bay Area originally, right? But I actually came from the East Coast, and up until the time I was over 40 years old, my career was spent in Washington, D.C. I left D.C. after the U.S. Congress stole an election from us in 1998, medical cannabis initiative that we won with 69% of the vote. And that made me decide to come out to California, where the Prop 215 was in the process of being implemented.
So let's get into that win and subsequent fight. Take us through the machination of what actually happened there.
So in 1996, I had friends and came out to California and donated to and worked on Prop 215 and was very much inspired for it, and went back home to Washington, D.C. and started working on a version of a medical cannabis initiative in D.C. We took it a couple steps farther than Prop 215 did. We explicitly provided for the creation of nonprofit dispensaries. And we organized a very potent grassroots campaign. We ended up winning with 69% of the vote. We carried every single precinct in the city, which never happens in Washington, D.C., because it's a racially divided city. And the U.S. Congress stepped in and put a rider on the D.C. appropriations bill preventing D.C.'s government from spending any money to implement the law. We actually even had to sue the government in order to get them to count the votes in the first place.
So you did sue, you did win, they did count, it was 69%.
We know it was 69%, and in what is still probably remains the single most disillusioning and infuriating experience of my life, the U.S. Congress stepped in and took this vote from us. And I, like most Americans, have been brought up with the notion that one person, one vote, your vote is sacred, every vote counts, every voter is important, and it was just profoundly disillusioning to me to see that the U.S. Congress was willing to trample democracy in such a blatant kind of fashion.
And we're doing work, and the folks in the industry that and some of which we've had on are certainly doing the work to make sure that that kind of thing just can't happen again.
Well, I'm happy to report that the initiative has finally been implemented in Washington, D.C. There now are medical cannabis dispensaries in the city, and beyond that, the city has legalized the personal possession and cultivation of personal quantities of cannabis. When the U.S. Congress threatened the mayor of Washington with prosecution for contempt of Congress if she implemented those laws, the mayor dared the Congress to come arrest her, and of course we know that they did not rise to that challenge. So I'm really, really proud of the mayor and of the city for finally getting those laws enacted.
And it only took 20 years, right?
Yeah, sometimes people ask me, did you ever think all of this was going to happen, Steve? And I'm like, yes, I actually did. I imagined it a long, long time ago. What I'm surprised about is how long it's taken us.
Right. And so, yeah, you can tell how long folks have been in the industry or with the movement, if you will, by who says how quickly things are happening, So anyway, let's go back, though, further. Where are you originally from?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at precisely 4:20 p.m. in the afternoon.
That can't be true.
That's true. I didn't actually know it myself until about 4 years ago, when one of my staff was going through my records and reorganizing all my files, and I hear this cry from the other side of the room, no way, this can't be true. And I'm like, what? And she's like, no way. And she's waving this piece of paper around. I come over and look at it. It's the original copy of my birth certificate. And I'd never even known that. So, you know, I have no idea how Mom pulled it off with amazing foresight and planning, but somehow she gave birth to me at precisely 4:20 p.m.
Fantastic. That's amazing, really, truly. How long did you spend in Philadelphia?
We moved to D.C. when I was about 3 years old.
Okay, so you were in D.C. So you're a D.C. guy at the time of this whole thing happening back then.
I am. You know, I grew up in Washington, D.C., largely during the 1960s and 70s, a time of, you know, great amount of social ferment. And I was part of the anti-war movement. This is the Vietnam War.
Thank you.
Before I even experienced cannabis and was part of the cannabis movement.
Really, before you had even experienced cannabis, you were part of anti-war. So it's in the mind, certainly, and also the heart. When did the plant reach you, or you reach the plant?
So I first encountered the plant when I was 13 years old. I was at a friend's house. I initially really didn't feel much of anything. I left the house. I started walking back home. I went through a park that I had passed through 150 times. It was just a thoroughfare for me. But this time I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. I noticed the wind blowing on my neck, and I noticed the sound of the leaves in the trees that were being blown by the same wind. And I heard the crunch of those leaves underneath my feet as my feet stepped on them. And I heard the gurgling of the creek, and then I felt the sweat coming out on the back of my neck. And I knew in some really profound way that all of these things were interconnected, that I was connected to that creek and those trees and the wind and the sunlight in this very intimate web of life. And looking backwards on that experience, I now recognize it as my first really genuine spiritual encounter and experience. And it was tremendous. And I knew, I think immediately at a deep intuitive level, that cannabis was a good plant, that it wasn't evil, and that it was going to play a really important role in my life.
And so from 13 to 40, when did the plant and your activism, your inherent activism, kind of meet? Was it when you were 40, or was it before then?
Well, it was almost immediately, because I'd been involved I grew up in a civil rights family. I went to Martin Luther King's March on Washington when I was 5 years old.
You did? You were there?
I was there. My mother had us make up sandwiches before in the morning, and then we went down to the demonstration and handed out sandwiches to all of the marchers.
What was that like? What did you take from that? That's an epic, historic moment.
I remember making the sandwiches, and I remember handing the sandwiches out. I don't remember anything else about the day.
Because you were 5.
Because I was 5, right?
The people were nice. They accepted the sandwiches.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. I was with my mom. We were giving out sandwiches. It was cool. I don't think I had a sense of the historic importance, or at least I didn't recognize it at that point.
Okay.
So the activism in cannabis came together for me almost immediately, just because I was already an activist. And I remember looking in Washington, D.C.'s underground newspapers called the Quicksilver Times, and I saw a picture of Allen Ginsberg, and he was like in some snowstorm wearing an overcoat. He looked kind of miserable, but he had this scrawled sign that said, "Pot is fun." And it was the first time that I'd ever seen any kind of activism related to cannabis. And it was just like immediately inspiring to me.
Right.
And within a year or two after that, I had joined the Yippies, which was sort of the most colorful group of what remained of the new left of the 1970s at that point. And ran away from home, dropped out of high school at 16 years old, and joined the revolution.
So of the names that we all know, who did you meet? Abby Hoffman, or?
Well, I never met Abby, because by the time I came on the scene, he was underground.
Okay.
And he was underground, but I did talk to him on the phone. Right. So Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were mainly out of the scene at that point, but I did meet a guy named Tom Forssad, who is one of the great unknown characters of the underground. Tom was the original publisher of High Times magazine, and also one of the largest cannabis smugglers on the East Coast. He landed, multi-ton loads of cannabis on ships, rolled them right into Jamaica Bay Harbor in New York City. So he was a remarkable audacious, committed social entrepreneur who certainly influenced me throughout my lifetime.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That person and that activity certainly, it reeks, if you will, of Steve DeAngelo.
Yeah, Tom was a real role model for me. Up until the time I met Tom, I came out of the New Left, and so I sort of had this idea that if you were going to do political work, you did it in the context of a commune or an organization or a revolution. And what I learned from Tom was that you can actually make very, very powerful social change by creating businesses that allow you to make money and promote your values at the same time. And it was a very compelling model for me, and one that has become the central focus of my life.
Indeed, and we only have a short amount of time today, so I do kind of want to skip forward to San Francisco, where you did start a business. Was Harborside created immediately, or what was first?
Well, I got out to the Bay Area around 2000, and my intention from the beginning was to explore the medical cannabis scene and see where I could provide some value. And at that time, there were two kinds of dispensaries: those that had been started by well-meaning activists who were long on good intentions but short on business experience or startup capital. And their operations reflected that. They were friendly but often very amateurish, and very low levels of security or customer service or selection. Despite that, they started taking in millions and millions of dollars because there was no other legal alternative. And that attracted a second group of people who really liked the fact that it was legal under state law but not properly regulated yet. Gray market operators. So we had one guy whose previous gig was selling Kona coffee, organic Kona coffee. It was neither organic nor from Kona. We're pretty sure it was coffee, but it wasn't anything like what it was supposed to be. Right? Another character, his previous gig had been running an underground casino in Anchorage, Alaska, and his buddies backed him with a few $1 million to come in and get into medical cannabis in California. You can imagine the sort of thing that he put together.
So these are the characters.
These are the characters, and it was clear to me that the image of medical cannabis was shifting from one of compassion and service to one of criminality and exploitation. And I saw the whole movement being endangered by that. And so it was clear to me that that a gold standard of cannabis retailing was needed, something that could prove to the world that when done responsibly, cannabis can bring benefits to communities rather than harms. And that's what we set out to do with Harborside, and close to 9 years later, I think we've pretty well accomplished that goal.
People say good things, is what I'll say, Steve.
Thank you.
So how long did it actually take to get going? From the moment of, okay, I think that I should be doing this, to, look, my doors are open.
It was about a 2.5-year process from the time that I started actively searching for locations and licensing to the time that we opened our doors and actually started serving patients.
And when you started serving patients, did you have that entrepreneur's kind of thing happen where mistakes are made early on?
Oh yeah, I knew from the beginning that we were going to make a lot of mistakes, and I sat down with my crew and I said, look, we're doing something that's never been done before, ever, in the history of the world, probably, certainly in the history of modern United States of America, and we will make mistakes. And you know what? That's okay. Don't run from them. Embrace them, because each one of those mistakes has the potential to be a really valuable lesson. And that's been our philosophy from the beginning. It remains our philosophy. You have to keep on moving forward. You will make mistakes, and you learn from them.
What was the biggest lesson learned early on? Maybe we were going one way and this happened, and so we knew to change it, and that's been a big lesson.
Well, I think the very first lesson was just remaining true to ourselves and to our commitment. So, we knew from the beginning that if we opened Harborside, there was a potential that we'd be targeted by the federal government and possibly criminally prosecuted. This is back in the days of George Bush was still president.
I remember him.
Remember? What we didn't expect was that we would be confronted with that choice the very first day that we opened our doors. So 10 minutes before we were supposed to open our doors on our first day of business, I get a phone call. The DEA is raiding locations, medical cannabis locations in San Francisco and Oakland. They've raided 3 so far. You might be next.
10 minutes before you open, day one.
Day one. And so we're sitting there going, oh, wow. We knew we might be confronted with this. We thought we'd have a chance to get our breath or something, right? Now, we have to make the decision now, right now? And, we looked at each other and looked into each other's eyes, and we basically knew there was only one way we were going to answer that question, and we opened up the doors, and we haven't looked back since.
That's excellent. And I guess they did not join you that day.
They did not join us that day, and in fact they have never raided Harborside, because they know perfectly well that if they did, that no jury in the Bay Area would ever convict us. And if they attempted to have such a trial, it might well be the last cannabis trial that they ever got to mount.
Yeah, and they can't lose, is what it really is.
Well,
I'm saying they can't be on record as losing is what the mindset must be inside.
Oh yeah,
Right.
because I mean, if you take on an organization like Harborside in a highly publicized, what would be a very lengthy and controversial trial, and you lose, it's going to be very, very difficult to take on that same kind of tactic the next time around.
And that speaks to what you are given credit for, which is out of the shadows and into the light. Talk about that philosophy.
Well, it's interesting. There's a little anecdote that goes along with that tagline too. When we first went into the Harborside Oakland building, our main dispensary room was windowless. A wall had been put up across all of the windows in that room and had been chopped into little cubicles. My designer took a look at this wall and she said, all of that has to come down. And I sort of gulped because I'm thinking about demolition costs. And then I realized, if we take down that wall, there's going to be a whole bank of windows, and that potentially people could see in those windows into the dispensary. And that made me nervous because every other dispensary I'd been in dispensed their cannabis in a windowless room deep within the facility, right? And so I was like, gee, that's kind of daring. And she looks at me and she goes, what's wrong? Or why do you not want to take that wall down? It's going to be a beautiful room with lots of light that people will love being in. And I was like, yeah, what's wrong with me? I've got a license. It's legal. I'm certainly not ashamed of what I'm doing. And I was like, all right, take it down, out of the shadows and into the light.
There we go.
There we go. And then, of course, that line really resonated and became our motto.
And it's now almost an industry motto, and you've got a lot of folks, Saren Justice, who we talked to yesterday, who's one of them, who you have mentored over the years, and directly, and then by associations, kind of everybody else. What's your key kind of advice to entrepreneurs in the industry?
Well, in terms of being successful in business, I think that the key is following your passion. It's true in any business. It's particularly true in the cannabis business. This is a substance which remains illegal in the vast majority of markets all around the world. If you are going to be successful in this industry, you will necessarily be encountering many challenges and many bumps in the road. What gets you through those bumps in the road and those challenges, and sometimes heartbreaking moments and scary moments, is really a passion to do what you're doing. And so the great thing about the cannabis industry is that it's like a blank slate. It's been illegal since the creation of most modern business practices. So whether you're into software, real estate, coding, formulation, advertising, marketing, security, it really doesn't matter. There's some arena of opportunity for your skill set.
There you go. And you said it's been illegal since the beginning of most modern business practice. Of course, there's the 4,000 years prior to that it was legal.
Well, actually, if you study the history of cannabis, what you find is that the plant has attracted the anger of elites, whether they're economic, religious, or cultural elites throughout time. I started my book, The Cannabis Manifesto, in 1492 in Spain, because part of the Spanish Inquisition was the eradication of cannabis use in Spain. But I easily could have gone back to the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries in Egypt, where you had a very conservative ruling class who was upset that the lower class folks who followed a more moderate path of Islam were consuming large amounts of cannabis, to the degree that cannabis users were strapped into chairs in the public gardens of Cairo and had their teeth forcibly extracted without anesthesia as a deterrence to other people who would use cannabis. So this holocaust against cannabis is something that spans history. It's been seen in many countries and many cultures, and we're going to bring it to an end now in this generation.
It does feel like it's coming to an end. What do you think is the reason for, you mentioned elites or those in power having an issue with this for so many centuries?
This plant is amazing. With one seed, almost anybody, almost anywhere in the world can plant cannabis, and it will give them food, it will give them shelter, it will give them clothing, it will give them medicine, it will give them spiritual information, it will give them comfort. People who maintain elites of any type are all about concentration of power. Cannabis inherently distributes power more widely, and that's why it's always been the target of elites.
There we go. Okay. So we're getting into some pretty good stuff here, Steve. Thank you so much. Let's, though, focus on today because we don't have too much more time. What I would love to talk about is your thoughts on the industry, but before that, your thoughts on California. It's June of 2015. Tell us what's going on from your perspective.
So two major developments in California right now. One, we have state medical cannabis regulations pending in the legislature. It, at this point, is impossible to call whether those regulations are going to pass or not. Regardless of whether or not they pass, we expect to have an adult use initiative on the ballot in 2016. I'm happy to report that so far we have a unified process going on in California, and I think that the chances of that initiative passing are quite high.
Yeah. So this is a much different thing than Prop 19 in that the growers and industry and everybody is kind of all together marching towards the same point. Is that true for you?
You know, in 2010, the campaign was organized and funded by a fairly small subset of the overall industry and movement in California. The 2016 initiative is emerging from a really broad-based process of consultation amongst many, many different stakeholders. And it appears that we're headed towards a draft that will have something in it that everybody likes. It no doubt will have something in it that each group is not going to like too, but I think that we've all in California come to a point of maturity and understanding that that's just part of the legislative process. And so we're going to do the best that we can with it and make sure that we have something that passes.
In terms of something that passes, what folks say is, you know, kind of respect the ecosystem, the cannabis ecosystem that exists as we speak in California. A lot of that has to do with outdoor grow. What else specifically needs to remain in whatever we vote on?
Well, you know, California is a unique state. Most of the states that have passed cannabis reform laws didn't have any type of existing supply system for cannabis. California is different. Not only have we for many years domestically produced enough cannabis for our own state, we've produced enough to export it to many, many other states. And so unlike states like Colorado, where there basically were no existing cannabis stakeholders that needed to be considered in the development of regulation, in California there are tens and thousands of families who have been built their livelihoods on cannabis, who pay their mortgages and send their kids to college by cultivating cannabis. And so any effective system of regulation in California has to make sure that it includes these existing stakeholders.
Multi-generational.
Multi-generational. We have people whose grandmothers were terrorized by the early cannabis raids.
Unbelievable. Okay, so that gives us a sense of where we are in California and where we're going and what we should be paying attention to. As far as the industry on the whole, you know, there's been a lot that has happened in the past year. You know, we're at the NCIA event this year. This is the second annual one, and we've got, you know, a completely different vibe than last year. So what's your sense of where we are industry-wide?
Well, industry-wide, we are the fastest growing industry in the United States of America. There is a vast amount of investor interest in the industry now. We are seeing just an explosion of creativity and entrepreneurship I almost, every encounter that I have, somebody is telling me about a new invention, a new product, a new way of doing things, and most of them sound like they're really, really good ideas. We're seeing increasing support on the political side. So we have folks like Rand Paul and Cory Booker and Kristen Gillibrand in the Senate who are pushing reform forward. We have our old stalwart allies like Sam Farr and Dana Rohrabacher in the House, and now they're being joined by a whole new younger generation of elected officials like Jared Polis. So I think that we're seeing the beginning of the end of the prohibitionist consensus in the U.S. Congress. It's going to take probably a few more years to completely dismantle it, but I think we're seeing the beginning of the end.
Which has got to be pretty satisfying for you, sir. So
it is tremendously satisfying. I've not been waiting. I have been struggling for this change to happen my entire life, and I'm conscious always of the angels on my shoulder. There are hundreds, thousands of people who also dedicated as much time and as much energy as I have to this movement, who sadly haven't lived to see this day of change. And so I hope that they're watching, and I hope that they're dancing and smiling as they see this change happening.
I'm sure that they are. 2 final questions. We ask everybody the same questions. What has most surprised you in cannabis? What has most surprised you in life? What has most surprised you in cannabis? That's the first one.
What has most surprised me in cannabis? I guess I would say the discovery of the endocannabinoid system and the degree to which it impacts human health. I mean, 20 or 30 years from now, the rediscovery of medical cannabis is going to be looked back upon as the most important development in medicine since the discovery of germ theory. I didn't quite see that one coming. I knew cannabis was valuable. I knew it was important. I didn't quite suspect that it had the tremendous curative and preventive properties that it does for such a wide range of grievous illnesses.
Yeah. It is remarkable, to say the least. Small question, what has most surprised you in life?
What has most surprised me in life? That everything has turned out so beautifully and so well. I just feel incredibly fortunate to be sitting in the place that I'm sitting, to have survived 40 years of the war on cannabis. And, I was at the Grateful Dead concert the other night, the last Grateful Dead concert ever in California.
You lucky bastard.
I was. I was very lucky. And as I was walking into the stadium, I looked up and I saw the rainbow flag flying over the stadium. And I started thinking about how 50 years ago, my generation, the baby boom generation, we made some promises. We made some promises about the environment. We made some promises about war and peace. We made some promises about sexual freedom and orientation. And we made some promises about cannabis. And it's taken us a lot longer. We said back then we want the world and we want it now. We didn't get it then. It's taken a lifetime. But I think our generation's done pretty good at leaving this world a bit of a better place than we found it. And that's profoundly satisfying to me.
Steve DeAngelo, thank you so much.
Most welcome, Seth, anytime.
So there you have it. Steve DeAngelo, the one and only. Very much appreciated his time. Absolutely a pleasure to sit down with him and get his insight on not only where we are, where we've been, and of course where we're going. So once again, Steve DeAngelo, thanks so much for your time. Much appreciated.